weddings in ancient China didn't begin with love at first sight. They began with strategy, family honor, and a middleman, the matchmaker. In a world where marriage wasn't just about two people, but about binding entire families together, the matchmaker's role was as vital as the officiant, the bride, or the groom. Without them, a wedding could not even begin. So, how did it work? Imagine a village or bustling city, families quietly calculating alliances. A father or mother might notice that their neighbor's son seemed promising, perhaps clever with his words, hard-working in the fields, or already showing signs of prosperity. That would be too bold, even disrespectful. Instead, they went through a matchmaker. This figure, often an older woman known for her social connections and keen judgment, was the one who built bridges between families. She would visit households, speak in careful, polite words, and gauge interest. It was a dance of subtlety. If one family seemed enthusiastic, the matchmaker carried whispers of approval back to the other. If hesitation lingered, she smoothed it over with flattery or reassurances. The matchmaker wasn't just a messenger, she was a negotiator, a psychologist, and sometimes even a trickster who could convince reluctant families that a union was fated. Once both sides showed interest, the process deepened. But before anything could move forward, the stars had to align. Literally, families exchanged the birth dates and times of the prospective bride and groom. These details weren't just trivial information. They were the keys to destiny. Astrologers or fortune-tellers compared the two charts, checking whether heaven itself approved of the match. If the stars predicted harmony, the process continued. If they forecasted doom, the marriage was abandoned, no matter how promising the family ties might have seemed. For the bride and groom themselves, the process was often distant. Many times, they hadn't even met. Young men might hear only faint rumors about their future wives. She was quiet, industrious, or came from a respectable family. Young women, meanwhile, might hear that their husbands were stable, from good stock, and had potential. Romantic love wasn't part of the early stages. In fact, it was seen as dangerous, even disruptive. Marriage was too important to be left to feelings, but this didn't mean that emotion was absent. Behind closed doors, parents whispered their hopes. A mother might pray that her daughter would find a kind man, not just a wealthy one. A father might wish that his son's new bride would bring good fortune and manage the household well. The matchmaker, sensing these unspoken desires, carefully molded her words to reassure them. When both families agreed, the matchmaker's work was formally recognized. Gifts were exchanged, documents drawn up, and promises made. From this moment onward, the couple was considered bound, even before they ever laid eyes on one another. The first step had been taken. The families were now intertwined, and backing out was unthinkable. It's easy to imagine the anxiety of the bride, waiting to meet the man she would spend her life with, or the nervous excitement of the groom, wondering if his new wife would be beautiful, hardworking, or perhaps even stubborn. But they had little say. What mattered was that the match was approved by families, sanctioned by heaven, and arranged by the trusted hands of the matchmaker. This was the first step of an ancient Chinese wedding, not a whisper of romance, but a carefully crafted negotiation between families, sealed with superstition, tradition, and the steady guidance of a woman whose words carried enormous weight. In ancient China, a wedding could not be rushed. Even if both families agreed, even if gifts were exchanged, and even if the bride and groom were eager, none of it mattered until one critical question was answered. When the date of the wedding was not chosen at random, it was carved out by the stars, written into the universe, and carefully selected through the intricate lens of astrology. The Chinese believed that timing wasn't just important, it was destiny itself. Every moment in life carried energy, a balance between yin and yang, the 5 elements and the 12 zodiac animals. Choosing the wrong wedding day could doom a marriage to arguments, infertility, or financial ruin. Choosing the right one, however, promised harmony, prosperity, and long life. So, how was this date chosen? First came the exchange of the bride and groom's birth information, the exact year, month, day, and even the hour of their birth. This wasn't just casual trivia, it was the DNA of their fate. Fortune-tellers, astrologers, or sometimes learned family elders would take these details and begin complex calculations. They compared the bride's destiny chart to the groom's, looking for clashes or alignments. If one was born under a fire sign and the other under water, it could signal conflict. If both carried complementary elements like wood and fire, it suggested growth and passion. Once the compatibility was settled, the astrologer turned to the calendar. Ancient Chinese calendars weren't just lists of days, they were cosmic maps. Each day was marked as auspicious or inauspicious for specific events: weddings, funerals, travel, planting crops, or even cutting hair. A family might pore over the calendar for weeks, narrowing down the best dates, before finally consulting a fortune teller to confirm their choice. The chosen day often reflected broader symbolism. Spring and autumn were seen as ideal seasons for weddings. Spring represented new beginnings, while autumn represented harvest and abundance. Winter, by contrast, was less favorable, its harshness thought to cool the fires of love. Within the day itself, the hour of the ceremony mattered. Morning weddings symbolized a bright start, while dusk ceremonies could be seen as unlucky, hinting at fading light and fading love. Of course, practicality had to blend with superstition. Wealthy families could afford to wait for the most perfect date, but poorer families sometimes had to compromise. Harvest times, weather conditions, and travel distance all played a role. Yet even among peasants, few dared to ignore the stars completely. Better to wait than to risk a marriage cursed from the beginning. And what of the bride and groom? For them, the chosen day might be a mix of excitement and nerves. Imagine the bride, her family whispering that her wedding would be in springtime, under an auspicious dragon month, or the groom, reassured that their astrologer had declared their union favored by heaven. The weight of this belief was enormous. If a marriage later soured, families might look back and blame the date. If only we had chosen differently, they would sigh. Even emperors followed this custom: imperial weddings, massive affairs that symbolized not just love but political stability, were always timed with extreme care. The entire empire was watching, and no ruler would risk angering heaven by marrying on a day marked as unlucky. The chosen day was more than just a line on a calendar. It was a cosmic blessing, a way of tying heaven and earth to the fate of two young people. When the families finally announced it, neighbors and relatives nodded with approval. It was official. The couple had not just their parents' consent, but the universe's as well. So while today we might check weather apps or venue availability, in ancient China, families looked skyward, trusting the stars to set the course of love. The wedding wasn't just about two people, it was a cosmic event, blessed or doomed depending on the flicker of celestial patterns overhead. Once the wedding date had been chosen by the stars, another important stage of the ancient Chinese marriage ritual began: the presentation of betrothal gifts. This moment was not simply about the groom's family showing off wealth or generosity. It was about respect, symbolism, and the weaving together of two households into one. Without these offerings, a union would not have been considered legitimate. Marriage in ancient China was never only a matter between two individuals. It was a bond between families, and the betrothal gifts stood at the heart of that bond. The giving of these gifts was highly formalized. In early traditions, the process was sometimes called the 6 rites, or 6 etiquettes, each step carrying its own meaning. The betrothal stage itself was one of the most visible to the community. When the groom's family sent their gifts to the bride's home, they did not do it in silence. Instead, there was often a ceremonial procession, attendants walking through the streets bearing boxes, baskets or chests, filled with goods. Neighbors and bystanders would gather to watch, whispering about the reputation of the groom's family. If the offerings were lavish, people would nod approvingly. If they seemed meager, gossip spread quickly. The gifts were not only for the bride's family, they were a message to the entire community. The objects included in this exchange varied across time and region, yet all carried deep meaning. Fine silks and cloth were almost always present. Silk was not only precious, but also symbolic of continuity, longevity, and the weaving of two lives together. Tea and wine were also common. Tea expressed respect and harmony, while wine promised abundance and celebration. Food items such as rice, millet, or preserved delicacies were often included to signify fertility and prosperity. Families believed that a house with full granaries would also be blessed with many children. Some households even sent live animals, most famously geese, because geese were thought to mate for life. To present a pair of geese was to wish for loyalty and unbroken partnership between bride and groom. Jewelry, ornaments, and sometimes jade also made their way into these betrothal packages. Jade was especially prized in Chinese culture. It was not simply a stone but a moral symbol, associated with purity, virtue, and resilience. To gift jade was to express the hope that the marriage itself would be unyielding and noble. And although these gifts carried practical value, their true purpose lay in the language of symbolism. Every object spoke a message. The silks promised wealth, the grains promised children, the geese promised fidelity, and the jade promised moral strength. Even the number of gifts mattered. The Chinese placed great weight on numerology, and gifts were carefully counted to reflect auspicious numbers. Even numbers were considered harmonious, and 8 was particularly desirable, because its pronunciation echoed the word for prosperity. 4, on the other hand, was avoided because it sounded too similar to the word for death. A misstep in the counting or arrangement of gifts could cast a shadow over the union, so families took great care to present them properly. When the procession arrived, the bride's family did not simply accept the offerings. They staged a ceremony of their own. The gifts were received, praised, and then a portion of them was returned to the groom's side. This practice, known as the return gift, was not meant as rejection but as balance. By sending back part of the offering, the bride's family acknowledged the generosity while asserting their own dignity. In some cases, they returned food items to show that the two households now shared sustenance. In others, they might provide clothing for the groom, signaling their preparation to send their daughter into her new life. The return gifts completed the exchange, binding the two families together in reciprocity. For the bride herself, the arrival of the betrothal gifts was a moment of mixed emotions. It was confirmation that her marriage was secure, that the agreements between the families were sealed, and that her new life was approaching quickly. Yet it also carried a bittersweet weight. The procession that brought silk, jade, and wine also carried the unspoken truth that she would soon leave her natal home. Each gift was a symbol not only of blessings for the future, but of separation from the past. Among the nobility and especially in imperial families, these traditions unfolded on a far grander scale. Instead of silk bolts or tea chests, there might be estates, political favors, or rare treasures sent as betrothal gifts. Still, the meaning remained the same. Whether in a humble village or the palace of an emperor, the betrothal gifts represented honor, respect, and the merging of two destinies. The ceremony of exchange created a foundation of balance. The bride's family was honored, the groom's family was validated, and the wider community witnessed a spectacle that proved the union was lawful, dignified, and blessed by tradition. More than material wealth, the betrothal gifts were a language of promises, binding together not just two young people, but two households and their ancestors. With the gifts given and returned, the marriage was no longer merely an agreement. It became an unbreakable bond, woven into ritual, witnessed by neighbors, and sanctioned by custom. The betrothal stage had been completed, and all that remained was for the bride to prepare for the journey that would soon carry her away from her family and into her new role as wife. If the betrothal gifts symbolized the groom's commitment to the union, then the dowry was the bride's family's reply, their final act of preparation before sending her into another household. The dowry was more than a collection of objects. It was a declaration of love, honor, and the parents' hope that their daughter would carry strength, dignity, and security into her new life. Without a dowry, even the most carefully arranged marriage seemed incomplete. For the bride's family was expected to demonstrate not only their ability to provide but their willingness to support the marriage with their blessings made tangible. The preparation of a dowry could begin months, sometimes even years, before the marriage was formally arranged. Families of means often set aside silks, jewelry, and crafted goods in anticipation of their daughter's future. For poorer households, it was a matter of sacrifice. Grain saved from harvests, coins hidden away, or handmade cloth carefully folded and stored until the day it would be needed. Whatever their station, families poured effort into the dowry, because it was not just wealth being transferred. It was their daughter's identity, her roots and her memory of home carried into her new world. When the time finally came, the dowry was prepared in an almost theatrical manner. Chests were filled with garments, bedding, and household necessities. Embroidered quilts, stitched by the bride's own hands, might be included, carrying within them nights of quiet work, each needle a reminder of her patience and devotion. Jewelry, hairpins, and ornaments offered her beauty and prestige. Tools or cooking vessels, though humble, represented the practical foundation of her new household. Sometimes, land deeds or livestock were added, ensuring financial security. It was not unusual for a dowry to contain symbolic items as well. Charms meant to ward off misfortune, red cloth for prosperity, or even a pair of scissors, signifying the cutting away of past troubles so that she could start anew. The display of the dowry was a public event, especially in villages where neighbors and extended kin would gather to watch. On the day it was sent to the groom's family, the bride's dowry was not simply packed and delivered quietly. Instead, attendants carried it through the streets in a slow procession, each chest or item balanced on poles or carts. In some regions, women sang dowry songs, verses filled with advice, warnings, and blessings for the bride. The spectacle made clear to everyone that this daughter was leaving with honor, and that her family had fulfilled their responsibility with pride. For the bride herself, the dowry was bittersweet. Every item reminded her of home. The quilts smelled of the familiar dye pots she had known since childhood. The jewelry often had been passed down from mothers and grandmothers, sparkling with the weight of family history. Even the simplest tools were chosen with care, meant to ease her work and remind her that she would never be without her parents' thoughtfulness. To carry these possessions into her husband's house was to bring a part of her family's soul along with her, even when distance and duty would separate her from them. Among elite families, the dowry became a matter of politics as much as tradition. Imperial princesses or noble daughters might be sent with dowries so vast that they rivaled small kingdoms. Entire convoys of carts, laden with lacquerware, bronze vessels, silks, and rare treasures, could be dispatched to mark the prestige of the bride's lineage. For such marriages, the dowry was less about personal comfort and more about signaling alliances. The larger the dowry, the greater the weight the bride carried into her new role. For she embodied not just herself but the status and power of her entire clan. Yet, no matter how grand or humble, every dowry carried the same emotional undercurrent. It was the last embrace of the bride's natal home. Her parents were saying, "We cannot go with you, but here are the tools, comforts, and reminders that will protect you when you are far from us." It was a farewell disguised as generosity. When the groom's family received the dowry, they displayed it alongside the earlier betrothal gifts, creating a balance between the two households. Together, the two sets of offerings represented harmony, reciprocity, and the union of families. Neighbors and relatives observed closely, for they believed that the way gifts and dowry matched each other would predict the fortune of the marriage. If the exchange seemed balanced, people spoke of long happiness. If it appeared unequal, whispers of trouble often followed. In this way, the dowry was not merely about possessions but about reputation, community, and continuity. The bride entered her marriage, not as a poor stranger, stripped of her ties, but as a woman carrying the honor of her ancestors and the generosity of her family. With her dowry, she was not arriving empty-handed. She was stepping into her new life carrying the weight of her old one, blending the two worlds into something lasting. And so, when the dowry was finally delivered and displayed, the path to marriage grew ever shorter. The bride's departure was near. The silks were folded, the quilts tied, the jewelry polished, and the farewell songs still lingering in the air. Soon, she would leave the home where she had been born, carrying with her not just her dowry, but the hopes of generations past. As the wedding day approached, the bride's world narrowed to a series of careful rituals and symbolic acts, each one designed to transform her from a daughter into a wife. These preparations were not simply about outward appearance. They were about purification, transition, and the severing of old ties so she could begin anew. For the bride, the days before her departure felt both solemn and surreal, as if every gesture carried the weight of destiny. One of the most significant steps was the cleansing ritual. On an appointed day, often chosen by diviners for its auspiciousness, the bride would bathe in water infused with herbs and fragrant petals. This was more than hygiene. It was a ritual washing away of misfortune, illness, and childhood innocence. The scented water was believed to cleanse her body and spirit, ensuring that she entered her new home free from impurities that might anger ancestors or disrupt harmony. In some regions, she also had her hair washed and combed by a respected elder woman, often her mother or an aunt, who would offer blessings with each stroke of the comb. The 3 strokes themselves carried meaning. The first for longevity, the second for prosperity, the third for many healthy sons. After cleansing came adornment. The bride's hair was styled in elaborate ways depending on the customs of her time and region. It might be parted and bound into buns, decorated with pins of jade, gold, or silver. Each ornament was more than decoration. It symbolized status, fertility, or continuity. Red ribbons were often woven into the hairstyle, red being the color of luck and joy. For elite brides, the preparation could take hours as attendants carefully positioned each accessory. For commoners, the look was simpler, but carried the same significance. Clothing was the most visible transformation. Traditionally, brides wore red robes, layers of silk or cotton dyed in the shade of celebration. The robe might be embroidered with phoenixes, dragons, peonies, or lotus flowers, symbols of prosperity, harmony, and endurance. In wealthier families, gold thread glittered across the fabric, and the garment itself became a work of art. In poorer homes, the robe might be modest, but even then, it was stitched with care, often by the bride herself, as a sign of devotion to her future role. Makeup, too, was part of the preparation. Rouge was applied to her cheeks, and vermilion touched her lips, turning her into the picture of vitality and beauty. A touch of black ink might lengthen her brows, giving her a dignified appearance. Yet beneath the paint and silks, many brides felt a heaviness in their hearts. They were not only dressing for celebration, but for farewell. In the days before departure, the bride also took part in emotional rituals with her family. One of the most poignant was the crying marriage, a custom found in some regions where the bride, her mother, and female relatives wept together in lament. Their crying was both grief and blessing, a release of sorrow at the parting, but also a way to honor the importance of the occasion. Songs were sometimes woven into the tears, verses that recalled the bride's childhood, praised her parents' care, and voiced hopes for her happiness. What sounded like mourning was in fact a form of love, acknowledging the depth of the transition. Meals in these final days also carried symbolism. The bride might eat special foods meant to bring luck, noodles for longevity, dumplings for prosperity, or sweet rice cakes to ensure harmony. Her parents often shared a last quiet meal with her, a moment of intimacy before she was surrounded by the noise and ceremony of marriage. Every bite tasted bittersweet, a reminder that soon the daily rhythms of home would no longer be hers. On the final night before departure, it was customary for the bride to sleep in new bedding, sometimes embroidered with auspicious designs. Friends or female relatives might keep her company, offering laughter and stories to ease her nerves. At times, the room would be lit with candles or lanterns, their glow casting a soft warmth as if to guard her through the last hours of her unmarried life. Morning brought the final transformation. As attendants adjusted her veil, often a red silk cloth that concealed her face, she ceased to be simply a daughter. Now, she was a bride, poised on the threshold of a new existence. Hidden beneath the veil, she could not show fear or sorrow. Her role was to embody dignity and quiet grace. The veil itself was heavy with meaning. It shielded her modesty, preserved mystery, and symbolized her shift into another family's protection. For her parents, the sight of their daughter veiled and dressed in wedding robes marked the moment of departure more sharply than any words. Their child was leaving. And though she would always be their daughter, her first loyalty would now belong to her husband's household. Thus, the bride's preparation was not merely about beauty or ritual. It was the crafting of a new identity, layer by layer until she stood ready to step out of her childhood home forever. If the bride's preparation was an intimate ritual of transformation, the wedding procession was its public spectacle. It was the moment when an entire community became witness to the transfer of a daughter from one household to another, the streets filled with noise, color, and anticipation. And though the details varied across dynasties and regions, the essence remained the same. The bride was leaving behind her old life and entering the unknown. The day began early. Musicians struck up loud, festive tunes with drums, gongs, and pipes, announcing to the neighbors that the groom's family had arrived to claim the bride. These sounds were not just for celebration. They were meant to drive away evil spirits lurking nearby, ensuring that the path ahead was clear. For families who could afford it, professional troupes performed elaborate pieces, filling the air with rhythms that echoed for blocks. For poorer households, even a single gong and flute could mark the joyous occasion. Central to the procession was the bridal sedan chair, painted bright red, decorated with tassels and embroidered curtains. It stood waiting like a small portable palace. Red was chosen for its power to bring luck, ward off misfortune, and symbolize the joy of the day. On the chair's panels might be painted phoenixes or peonies, emblems of feminine beauty and prosperity. For elite families, the chair could be richly carved and carried by sturdy porters in matching uniforms. For simpler weddings, the chair was plainer, but no less important. It remained the vessel of transition. The bride, veiled and silent, was escorted out of her family's house. This was often the most emotional moment, as her parents and relatives helped her into the chair. Some mothers whispered final words of advice, reminders to be obedient, to bring honor, to endure hardship with grace. Others simply touched the veil, unable to say more as tears fell. Once the bride was seated, her face hidden, she ceased to belong to her natal family. The curtain dropped, and she was gone. The sedan chair was lifted, and the procession began. Attendants carrying lanterns, banners, or parasols led the way. The groom's family members followed, dressed in their best robes, showing off their pride in gaining a new bride. Alongside them, friends, neighbors, and even curious onlookers joined in, creating a parade that turned the journey into a festival. Children sometimes ran alongside, laughing and shouting, drawn by the music and the spectacle. At times, firecrackers were lit along the path. The crackling explosions were believed to scatter lurking spirits, as well as to mark the joyous noise of union. The louder the celebration, the greater the protection, or so people believed. In wealthier regions, dancers and performers entertained the crowd as the procession moved, turning the wedding into a public carnival. For the bride inside the sedan chair, the experience was different. Hidden behind the red curtains, she could not see the streets filled with neighbors, nor the pride of her family watching her depart. Instead, she sat in silence, swaying with the rhythm of the porter's steps, hearing only the muffled sounds of music and laughter. This separation was deliberate. The veil and the chair emphasized her liminal state. She was no longer fully her parents' daughter, not yet fully her husband's wife. She was between worlds. Superstitions surrounded the journey. The procession avoided unlucky routes, steering clear of places associated with funerals or illness. If the chair passed a temple or shrine, offerings might be made to ensure divine favor. In some traditions, a boy child was asked to sit briefly on the bride's lap before departure, a symbolic act to bless her with sons in her marriage. Every detail, from the number of porters to the rhythm of the drums, carried symbolic weight. When the procession reached the groom's household, the noise reached its peak. Gongs clanged, firecrackers burst, and music swelled, all designed to announce the bride's arrival and to ensure no malevolent spirit followed her inside. At the doorway, the sedan chair stopped, but the bride did not step out immediately. Rituals had to be performed first. Sometimes the groom's mother would light a brazier, and the bride was carried over the flames, a symbolic act of purification as she crossed into her new life. Other customs included scattering grains, coins, or fruits to symbolize fertility and abundance. The moment the bride crossed the threshold was considered critical. One misstep or stumble could be seen as a bad omen, so attendants guided her carefully, often lifting her lightly to ensure her feet touched the ground in just the right way. At last, The bride entered the house of her husband's family, veiled and silent, greeted by the watchful eyes of her new relatives. The music faded. The firecrackers went quiet. But the meaning of the procession lingered. It had been a passage not just through streets, but through life stages, a crossing from the known into the unknown. For the community, the procession was entertainment, noise, and color. For the bride, it was the final farewell, her last glimpse, though veiled, of the world she was leaving behind. When the bridal procession finally arrived at the groom's home, the bride's journey was not yet complete. The moment of stepping across the threshold carried more weight than the entire noisy parade that had led her there. For ancient Chinese families, the entrance into the groom's household was a moment charged with symbolism, superstition, and unseen presences. Every gesture, every step, was watched not only by relatives and neighbors, but, in their belief, by the spirits who governed fortune, fertility, and harmony. At the doorway, the sedan chair stopped, and the air seemed to hold its breath. Inside the chair, the bride remained veiled, waiting in stillness. She was not permitted to simply climb down and walk in. First, rituals of purification had to be performed to ensure she entered safely, both physically and spiritually. In many households, a small fire was lit in a brazier at the threshold. The flames flickered, casting warm light on the ground, and attendants carefully lifted the bride or guided her to step over the fire. The fire symbolized purification, burning away evil influences that might cling to her from the journey. Passing over it meant she entered cleansed, free of misfortune, ready to bring prosperity to her husband's house. In other traditions, the threshold itself was treated as sacred. It was not simply a piece of wood or stone beneath the door. It was a line that divided two worlds. On one side was the familiar life of the bride's family. On the other was the new life waiting within. Spirits were believed to linger at thresholds, guardians, or tricksters who could influence fate. To guard against ill will, grains of rice or beans were sometimes scattered across the step, offerings to keep the spirits appeased. Coins might also be thrown to ensure wealth would follow the couple inside. One common practice was to place symbolic objects at the doorway, oranges or pomegranates for fertility, sugarcane for sweetness, or even a rooster whose crow was thought to chase away malicious spirits. If the rooster crowed loudly, it was taken as a particularly good omen. Sometimes, a young boy from the groom's family was positioned at the door to lead the bride in, symbolizing the wish for many sons. In some regions, the bride was asked to step onto a sack of grain, a quiet promise that she would never lack food in her married life. The threshold itself could not be touched carelessly. It was considered extremely unlucky for the bride to stumble while crossing it. Attendants were on hand to steady her, and in some cases, she was lifted entirely to ensure no accident could occur. Even the groom had to be cautious, for his household's reputation rested on how smoothly the moment unfolded. To trip at the entrance was to invite whispers of doom from superstitious neighbors. Inside the doorway, the bride often encountered her new mother-in-law first. This moment was delicate. The elder woman represented the authority of the groom's household, and the bride's relationship with her could determine much of her daily life. Bowing or offering symbolic gestures of respect was essential, and the mother-in-law might respond by lifting the bride's veil slightly, or offering her a sip of sweet wine, signaling her acceptance. But beneath these gestures lay deeper layers of belief. It was thought that the ancestors of the groom's family watched carefully as the bride entered. Ancestral tablets, often kept in the home, were silent witnesses to her arrival. Some families performed small offerings of incense or food at the household altar, formally introducing the bride to the spirits of the family line. From that moment on, she was no longer simply herself. She was a continuation of her husband's ancestry, responsible for honoring those who had come before and for producing heirs who would continue the line. The atmosphere around the crossing of the threshold was thick with contradictions. For the neighbors gathered outside, it was a cheerful spectacle, a chance to gossip and admire the bride's attire. For the family, it was a proud moment, a culmination of planning and expense. But for the bride, veiled and silent, it was a step into uncertainty. Behind the curtains, she could not see the rooster at the doorway, or the children playing with scattered coins. She only felt the lift of hands, the weight of silk robes, and the pressure of countless eyes as she passed from one world into another. Even after she entered, the rituals continued. Shoes were sometimes changed at the doorway, the old ones left behind so that no misfortune from her natal home could follow her into her new life. The symbolism was clear. She had shed her past step by step and walked into the responsibilities and expectations of marriage. This single act of crossing a threshold, something that in daily life went unnoticed, became, on a wedding day, the ultimate ritual of transformation. To outsiders, it looked simple, even quaint, but to the people of ancient China, it was the moment the spirits leaned closest, listening, watching, deciding whether to bless or burden the union. And so, every coin, every flame, every careful step was an appeal to unseen forces, a plea for harmony that would ripple through the rest of the couple's lives. If there was one sight that captured the essence of an ancient Chinese wedding, it was the brilliant flash of red. From the embroidered robes of the bride to the banners, fluttering in the wind, red dominated the day like no other color could. It was more than decoration. It was a language of symbols, a living shield against misfortune, and a promise of prosperity. To wear red on the wedding day was to wrap oneself in the protection of generations of tradition, and no bride entered her new life without it. The bride's attire was the centerpiece of this spectacle. When she emerged from her chamber in her father's home, veiled and layered in silk, she became something larger than herself. Ordinary garments no longer sufficed. Her robes were chosen with precision, stitched with patterns meant to invoke fortune. Red silk flowed around her like fire, heavy and dazzling under the sun. Golden thread embroidered phoenixes, a symbol of grace and feminine power, while dragons might be sewn in to represent the authority and balance of her husband together. Dragon and phoenix created harmony, embodying the ideal union of yin and yang. Her head was often crowned with intricate ornaments, sometimes including a headdress of pearls, kingfisher feathers, or dangling beads that obscured her features. This was not only to show wealth, but also to veil her from envious spirits who might seek to harm her beauty. Gold hairpins, some shaped like butterflies or lotuses, were pinned carefully in place. Each ornament carried meaning: butterflies for everlasting love, lotuses for purity, peaches for long life. Even her shoes, often embroidered with auspicious symbols like mandarin ducks or blooming flowers, contributed to the picture of marital blessing. Yet the bride was not the only one wrapped in red. The groom, though often dressed in darker robes of black or blue, also carried flashes of the sacred color. A red sash tied across his chest or around his waist marked him as the central figure of the day, binding him symbolically to the bride. Sometimes a long strip of red cloth called a hongshou was draped over both bride and groom and tied together, literally linking them as they performed the wedding rituals. Every guest, too, might wear small touches of red belts, hair ribbons, or embroidered patches, believing that the collective power of the color would create an aura of luck strong enough to drive away any lurking misfortune. Why red? In the world of ancient Chinese belief, red was the color of life itself. It represented blood, fertility, and fire, the very forces that sustained families. It was a color feared by demons and malevolent spirits who shrank from its brilliance. Hanging red banners across the door, wrapping gifts in red paper, even painting the wedding chamber red. All these were forms of spiritual protection. It was thought that if the color surrounded the couple, evil influences could not pierce through. The symbolism did not stop at protection. Red also embodied joy and abundance. At a time when famine and hardship were constant threats, the promise of plenty was no small thing. To dress a bride in red silk, dyed with costly pigments, was to display the family's wealth and their hope that she would bring prosperity with her into the marriage. The color spoke silently to the neighbors. Here was a family strong enough to clothe their daughter like royalty, to send her into her new life in splendor. And yet, beneath the beauty of the garments, there was weight, literal and symbolic. Some wedding robes were so heavy with embroidery and gold thread that attendants had to help the bride walk. She moved slowly, cautiously, every step echoing the burden of her new role. For a young woman, perhaps still in her teens, the layers of silk and ornaments felt less like clothing and more like armor. They transformed her into a figure that no longer belonged to her family or herself. She was, for that day, a vessel of tradition, a living symbol of union and continuity. When the time came for her to leave her father's home, the veil of red drawn over her face created a final separation. It shielded her from the gaze of strangers, but it also cut her off from the familiar world. Behind that veil, she might hear the laughter of siblings or the cries of her mother, but she could not look back. She walked forward, wrapped in red, toward a new household that demanded her loyalty. Even in the wedding chamber, red dominated. The bed would be draped in red linens, embroidered with auspicious motifs. Candles burned in red holders, their flames casting warm glows on the walls. Every object reinforced the same message. This marriage would be fertile, joyful, prosperous. No corner of the room was left untouched by the belief that color could shape destiny. Looking back, it is easy to admire the beauty of these customs, the shimmering silk, the artistry of the embroidery, the boldness of red banners fluttering in the breeze, all create a picture of elegance and grandeur. But for the people of ancient China, these were not mere aesthetics, they were defenses against chaos, invocations of fortune, and assurances to anxious families that their children's future was safeguarded. The wedding attire was not only what the bride wore, it was what the entire marriage wore. It was the color of life stitched into fabric, draped across households and carried into the future like a flame that refused to go out. If the wedding attire was the spectacle, then the banquet was the performance. No ancient Chinese wedding was complete without a feast that seemed to stretch as far as the eye could see, or at least as far as the kitchen could provide. To be married without a banquet would have been like staging a play without an ending. The food was more than a meal. It was an offering, a social display, and a prayer woven into every dish. The scale of the banquet depended, of course, on the wealth of the families involved. For aristocrats and wealthy merchants, the tables groaned under the weight of dozens of courses. Entire kitchens and battalions of servants worked for days to prepare them. For peasants, the fare might be more modest, but the symbolism was no less potent. Even a single bowl of noodles, if served in the right spirit, could speak volumes. Every dish carried meaning. Noodles were long, deliberately left uncut, symbolizing a wish for the couple's long life together. Cutting them was unthinkable. It was said to cut short the life or fortune of the bride and groom. Dumplings, shaped like little ingots, were scattered across the tables as edible symbols of wealth. Their folded skins concealed savory fillings. But what they really concealed was the hope for prosperity. Whole chickens were often served as well, representing unity and completeness. A rooster and a hen together symbolized the harmony of husband and wife. Fish, always presented whole with head and tail intact, carried its own wordplay. The word for fish, sounded like the word for surplus. To eat fish at the wedding meant that the marriage would not merely survive but thrive, always blessed with more than enough. Then there were the sweet dishes, often reserved for the end of the meal. Glutinous rice balls, sticky and chewy, symbolized togetherness. After all, who could separate such sticky rice? They were sometimes served in sweet soup, their round shape echoing the fullness of family unity. Dried fruits and pastries sweetened the air, ensuring that the couple's life together would be as sweet as the sugar on their tongues. But food was not only for the couple, it was for the guests too, who judged the generosity and status of the families by the abundance of dishes. A lavish banquet was a public declaration of wealth and influence. To be invited was to be honored, to be seated close to the bride, and groom was to be recognized as important. Guests laughed, toasted, and sometimes challenged each other in drinking games. Their cups filled with rice wine, the louder the cheer, the stronger the belief that joy would echo into the couple's future. Music accompanied the feast. Drums, flutes, and stringed instruments played melodies that mingled with the clinking of cups and the chatter of voices. Sometimes acrobats or performers entertained the crowd, their feats adding another layer of spectacle to the already crowded tables. The banquet became not just a meal, but an event where the senses were overwhelmed. Sight, sound, taste, all woven together into a tapestry of celebration. And yet, even here, superstition lingered. Certain foods were avoided. Bitter dishes were rare, for bitterness was no flavor to bring into a marriage. Sharp or broken foods could be interpreted as symbols of discord. The menu was carefully chosen to keep ill omens far from the couple's first steps together. Even the placement of the dishes mattered, with pairs of foods often presented side by side to mirror the new union. The banquet also carried an undercurrent of obligation. Families were expected to host well, to show not only their joy but their capability. A poorly provisioned feast could spark whispers of stinginess, incompetence, or worse, a curse of misfortune for the marriage. In this way, the banquet was not only about feeding mouths, but about feeding reputations. As the night wore on, the couple themselves ate little. The bride, veiled and surrounded by attendants, might nibble at symbolic dishes, but rarely indulged in the full spread. Her focus was on the rituals, the guests, and the looming transition ahead. The groom, too, drank and toasted with guests more than he dined. The real consumption was left to the attendees, who made merry in the couple's honor still. The symbolism remained. To serve abundance was to ensure abundance. To sweeten the guests' mouths was to sweeten the couple's fate. To pour rice wine until the cups overflowed was to promise that the household's joy would overflow too. In the end, the banquet was as much about the community as it was about the bride and groom. A wedding was never just a private union. It was a social event that bound families, neighbors, and friends together. And through the feast, the community itself blessed the couple, filling their future with the flavors of prosperity, unity, and sweetness. The wedding attire clothed them in tradition, but it was the banquet that nourished the marriage. Every bite, every sip, every laugh shared over the table became part of the couple's story, written not in words but in flavors that lingered long after the last dish was cleared. If the banquet filled the belly, then the music and dance filled the spirit. Ancient Chinese weddings were not silent affairs. They were alive with sound and movement, a carefully orchestrated display meant to delight the guests, honor the ancestors, and chase away anything unlucky lurking nearby. Without music, a wedding would feel unfinished, like a play without dialogue or a festival without fireworks. The instruments came first. Drums beat out a steady rhythm, deep and resonant, their vibrations echoing through the courtyard or hall. Flutes added a higher, more delicate voice, like birds singing above the steady march of footsteps. Stringed instruments such as the guqin or the pipa painted melodies across the air, weaving elegance into the celebration. Cymbals clashed in bursts, announcing key moments with metallic brilliance. Together, these instruments created not just music but an atmosphere, one that lifted the mundane into the ceremonial. Music was not only for entertainment, it was a ritual tool. Certain songs were considered auspicious, their melodies believed to summon blessings or drive away misfortune. Performers knew exactly what to play, when to play it, and how to shift from solemn tones during the rituals to lively tunes when the feasting began. Guests could hear the transition, feeling the event itself move from sacred duty to joyous celebration. Dance, too, carried meaning. Professional dancers were sometimes hired to perform, their movements deliberate and symbolic. In aristocratic households, the dances might echo court traditions, refined and slow, with flowing sleeves that extended the dancer's gestures into something larger than life. For more humble weddings, local folk dances often took center stage. These were energetic, filled with stomps, spins, and bright costumes, the kind of movement that pulled even shy guests into the circle. Some dances were playful, even humorous. Masked performers acted out skits that poked fun at everyday life, bringing laughter to the tables. Others imitated animals or legendary heroes, turning myth into motion, and in some regions, martial dances were performed, with young men brandishing spears or sticks, showing off strength and discipline in honor of the groom. The crowd roared approval, their cheers mingling with the beat of the drums. Guests themselves were not always mere spectators. Drinking games often blurred the line between audience and performer. Music swelled, cups of rice wine were raised, and suddenly someone was coaxed into singing a folk song or showing off a dance step. These moments, half spontaneous and half expected, bound the community closer together. A wedding without such outbursts might have felt too stiff, too quiet. Entertainment extended beyond music and dance. Storytellers sometimes appeared, recounting tales of legendary couples, or reciting poetry written especially for the bride and groom. In wealthy households, acrobats or jugglers were invited to perform, balancing on poles, tossing objects in the air, or contorting their bodies into impossible shapes. Fire breathers and puppet shows occasionally added to the spectacle, especially in regions where weddings spilled into the streets as public celebrations. But always, the underlying purpose of all this entertainment was the same: to bless the marriage. Loud music was thought to frighten away wandering spirits. Laughter created joy that clung to the household like incense smoke. Dance brought energy, ensuring that the couple's new life together would be active, fertile, and full of movement. Even when guests thought they were simply enjoying a good show, they were participating in an ancient system of symbolism. Of course, there was also competition. Families wanted their weddings to be remembered, not forgotten. A grand display of music and dance reflected not only joy but prestige. The more elaborate the entertainment, the greater the family's honor in the eyes of the community. For some, this meant spending beyond their means, hiring the best performers they could find. For others, it meant relying on the talents of friends and neighbors, creating a celebration less polished but no less heartfelt. And then there were the songs sung specifically for the couple. Some praised the groom's virtues, comparing him to dragons and phoenixes. Others described the bride's beauty in metaphors of flowers, pearls, and moonlight. These songs were both compliments and blessings, lifting the couple onto a stage of idealized harmony. In hearing themselves praised, the couple was reminded of the roles they were now expected to embody. By the end of the evening, the music and dance often blurred together with the banquet itself. Guests clapped along to rhythms while finishing their food. Children mimicked the dancers. The bride and groom, though sometimes shy, were drawn into the spectacle, coaxed into lifting a cup, stepping to the music, or at least smiling as the performers directed their joy toward them. The entertainment was more than noise and movement. It was the beating heart of the wedding, the element that transformed ritual into memory. Long after the food was eaten and the clothes were stored away, it was the music, the laughter, and the spectacle that guests carried with them. And in that way, the sounds and dances of the night lingered, echoing into the new household as a reminder that marriage was not only solemn, it was joyous, alive, and worthy of celebration. When the music faded and the banquet's last cups were drained, the most whispered about part of the wedding began. The bridal chamber rituals, for all the grandeur of the ceremony and the noise of the feast, the true purpose of the marriage waited in the quiet of the night. And while it might seem like what happened in the bridal chamber was private, in ancient China it was anything but. Tradition wrapped those first moments of intimacy in layers of ritual, symbolism, and even public spectacle. The bride was escorted into the chamber first. Her phoenix crown and heavy veil might already have been removed, but she was not left entirely alone. Female relatives, sometimes accompanied by the matchmaker, led her into the room and seated her on the edge of the bed. This bed was no ordinary piece of furniture. It was specially prepared, sometimes stuffed with auspicious herbs, or decorated with embroidered silk depicting dragons and phoenixes. Red dominated everything: the sheets, the pillows, the candles, because red symbolized prosperity, joy, and protection against evil. The groom did not simply stroll in casually. He too was led into the room, often by his friends or younger male relatives. And here's where things could get playful. Guests would sometimes linger outside the chamber, shouting jokes, teasing the couple, or demanding small performances before the door was allowed to close. In some regions, these games could get rowdy, with the bride and groom forced to answer riddles, share a cup of wine, or attempt small challenges while laughter echoed in the hallway. Far from private, the first steps into married life were accompanied by the noise of community approval or mockery. Once the door was shut, the rituals turned more solemn. One of the most important acts was the sharing of wine. The bride and groom sat side by side, a red ribbon sometimes tied between their cups. They lifted the cups, drank together, and in doing so symbolized the joining of two lives, two families, into one. This act wasn't only about alcohol. It was about sealing a bond, with the red ribbon binding not just the cups but the destinies of the drinkers. Candles burned brightly in the chamber, often shaped like dragons and phoenixes, or engraved with characters wishing for fertility and long life. As the wax melted, it was believed the couple's fortune melted into a shared pool, binding them closer. Superstition held that if the candle burned steadily through the night, their marriage would be smooth. If it sputtered or went out, it was a bad omen. Guests sometimes snuck a peek in the morning just to see how the candle fared, gossiping about whether the union had started under a lucky sign. Food, too, played its part. Bowls of nuts, seeds, and dried fruits were often placed near the bed, especially items whose names sounded like sons or fertility in Chinese. Eating them together symbolized the hope for many children. In wealthier households, intricate pastries shaped like lotus seeds or fish were added, each bite a reminder of abundance and harmony. Even the bed itself might hide lucky items, slipped between the sheets by mischievous relatives who wanted to ensure the first night was full of omens for future offspring. Then came the untying of the bride's hair ornaments. This act, gentle and deliberate, symbolized the transition from maidenhood to wifehood. In some traditions, the groom himself removed certain pins or ribbons, marking his role as the one who would now share her life. The intimacy of this ritual was both practical and symbolic. Unveiling the bride was unveiling the future. In many regions, friends of the groom or playful relatives staged bed games, barging into the room to interrupt or demand performances before leaving the couple in peace. Sometimes they hid shoes, tied knots in garments, or placed funny objects under the bed, turning the most private moment into a shared joke. As disruptive as it sounds, these games were meant to ease nerves, add laughter to a serious moment, and ensure that the couple's first night was not clouded with fear. Of course, the heart of the bridal chamber ritual was consummation, but even this was wrapped in meaning. Producing heirs was not just personal, it was a duty to the family line. The ancestors themselves were believed to watch. Fertility prayers whispered during the day carried into the night, as every gesture seemed tied to the hope for sons and daughters who would continue the family's honor. By dawn, when the doors opened again, the bride and groom were no longer individuals, but a pair bound by ritual, community, and expectation. The chamber itself stood as witness to the transition. Guests peeked in to see the red candles still glowing, the cups drained, the bed slightly rumpled, and they whispered judgments about how well the night had gone. So while modern weddings often fade into quiet after the party, in ancient China the night was its own performance. The bridal chamber was not simply a room for privacy. It was a stage where laughter, ritual, superstition, and intimacy blended into the foundation of a marriage. If the wedding banquet fed the stomach and the bridal chamber stirred whispers, then the exchange of gifts and the display of dowry fed another hunger entirely: status. In ancient China, weddings weren't just unions of two hearts. They were negotiations of wealth, prestige, and social standing. And nothing showed that more clearly than the parade of gifts that flowed between families. The dowry was the bride's family's statement to the world. It wasn't just a box of clothes and jewelry. It was an inventory of everything she would bring into her new life. Silk garments folded neatly, bedding embroidered with lucky symbols, lacquered chests filled with ornaments, sometimes even livestock or servants. Red was the dominant color, of course. Red silk coverings, red lacquer boxes, red ribbons tied to the handles of trunks. Red didn't just look festive, it shouted prosperity and warded off the lurking bad luck that always tried to sneak into big life transitions. The size of the dowry mattered. A grand procession of carts, servants, and bearers trailing into the groom's household told the neighbors. This bride came from wealth, and she carried her share of it with her. Poorer families couldn't compete, of course, but they still tried to put together the best dowry possible, even if it was modest. To send a daughter with nothing was seen as shameful, as though the family hadn't honored her or her future. So even in the humblest villages, a small trunk with clothing, perhaps a few embroidered cloths, and symbolic items like scissors or combs would be carefully prepared. The items themselves weren't chosen at random. Each had meaning. A pair of scissors symbolized the cutting away of misfortune. A mirror reflected brightness and clarity, ensuring the bride's new home would be filled with harmony. Needles and threads spoke of diligence and the skills expected of a wife. Jewelry in gold or jade wasn't only decoration, it carried wishes for longevity and virtue. Everything had a symbolic purpose, and together it formed a kind of protective circle around the bride as she stepped into her new household. On the groom's side, gifts flowed too. The bride price, or betrothal gifts, had usually already been sent before the wedding, a formal acknowledgement that the marriage was agreed upon. These included items like wine, food, silks, and in wealthier families, gold or livestock. They weren't just tokens of respect, they were proof the groom's family could support the bride and honor her parents. The more lavish the gifts, the more seriously the groom's side appeared to take the marriage. But the real spectacle came when the dowry was delivered to the groom's household. Picture a line of bearers carrying red-covered trunks, baskets filled with embroidered quilts, ornate boxes containing jewelry, sometimes even furniture. The procession was designed to be seen. Neighbors lined the streets, whispering about how much or how little was being sent. Children pointed at the shining objects. Musicians might even accompany the dowry, banging drums and playing flutes, turning the transfer of goods into a miniature parade. Inside the groom's home, the dowry was displayed before the family and guests. Each trunk was opened, each item lifted up for inspection. Bedding was unfolded to reveal bright patterns of dragons and phoenixes. Jewelry was passed around, gleaming in the candlelight. Even ordinary household items, like combs, brushes, or kitchenware, were shown proudly, because they symbolized the bride's readiness to take on her new role. This public display was not about practicality. It was about sending a message. The bride arrived prepared, and her family honored the marriage with their generosity. And then came the comparisons. Guests and neighbors couldn't help but measure the dowry against others they had seen. Was it larger than the last wedding? Was it finer? Did it match the groom's family status, or did it fall short? Weddings were community spectacles, and gossip was inevitable. A generous dowry earned respect. A meager one sparked whispers that might linger for years. In a culture where family honor stretched across generations, such judgments mattered. Of course, not all families could afford extravagance. Some even went into debt to put together a dowry worthy of display. The pressure was immense, especially in elite circles, where marrying well was as much about alliances as it was about love. Still, the symbolism of the items often mattered more than their monetary value. A modest but thoughtfully prepared dowry carried its own weight of respect. In the end, the exchange of gifts and the spectacle of the dowry weren't only about wealth. They were about weaving the bride into her new household, carrying with her the blessings, skills, and honor of her birth family. The gifts represented not just what she owned, but what she symbolized: continuity, prosperity, and the bridge between two family lines. When the dowry procession ended and the items were placed carefully in her new chamber, the bride wasn't stepping into her marriage empty-handed. She came surrounded by symbols, wrapped in meaning, and supported by the weight of tradition. And for the watching neighbors, every trunk and every ribbon was another reminder that weddings in ancient China weren't simply unions of two people. They were declarations to the world of wealth, status, and family pride. If the wedding day itself was filled with spectacle, ritual, and endless ceremony, the true test of the marriage began the morning after. In ancient China, the dawn after the wedding wasn't simply a quiet recovery from the celebrations. It carried its own set of expectations, customs, and symbolism that revealed how the new couple would fit into their roles and into the family hierarchy. The first morning after the wedding was particularly important for the bride. She was no longer simply a guest dressed in finery, sitting silently through rituals. She had now crossed the threshold and officially become part of her husband's family. The way she behaved, the words she spoke, and the gestures she made were all watched carefully. Elders and in-laws measured her politeness, her obedience, and her ability to show respect. Even the smallest action could leave a lasting impression. One of the earliest tasks was serving tea. In many traditions, the bride was expected to rise early, long before she might have liked, and prepare to greet her new parents-in-law with tea. This wasn't just hospitality. It was a deeply symbolic act of filial piety, the cornerstone of Chinese family life. By offering tea, The bride demonstrated her respect and willingness to serve her new family. The groom often joined her, kneeling together as they presented steaming cups and porcelain bowls. In return, the parents, in-law, gave blessings, and often small gifts of jewelry or red envelopes, filled with coins marking their acceptance of the new daughter. In-law after tea came greetings to the rest of the family. The bride was formally introduced to grandparents, uncles, aunts, and older siblings of her husband. Each required a respectful bow. Each name carefully learned. Each gesture of humility performed. This wasn't simply etiquette. It was a statement of hierarchy. The bride needed to know her place within the extended family, and the family in turn observed how gracefully she took on her role. Food also played a role in the morning after. In many regions, a special breakfast was prepared for the couple. Often something sweet. Dumplings, sticky rice balls, or sweet soup symbolized harmony and happiness in the marriage. Eating together in front of relatives reinforced the hope that their bond would be smooth and prosperous. Guests who had stayed overnight might also join, turning breakfast into another miniature feast. Though lighter than the wedding banquet of the day before, there were also customs tied to fertility. The morning after was often when discreet inquiries or subtle jokes were made about the couple's first night together. Elders wanted reassurance that the marriage had been consummated, since producing heirs was one of the most important duties of a married couple. In some regions, symbolic foods like eggs dyed red or dishes featuring fish were served, meant to bless the couple with children. Fertility was never far from people's minds, and the morning after was when those expectations began to show. For the bride, the scrutiny could feel relentless. She had to appear calm, modest, and respectful, even if she was tired, nervous, or overwhelmed. Smiling too much might be seen as frivolous. Speaking too boldly might be judged as arrogance. Yet appearing too quiet could also spark whispers. It was a delicate balance, and much of her reputation within the household began to form on that first morning. In wealthier families, the morning after might also include a formal inspection of the bride's dowry. Elders or attendants would look over the items delivered the day before, ensuring they were properly placed and arranged within her new quarters. This wasn't just about possessions. It was another opportunity to show how well prepared the bride had been, and how smoothly she could now transition into managing her household space. Meanwhile, the groom's role was lighter, but still present. He was expected to escort his wife, support her in greeting the elders, and show that he was both proud of her and respectful to his parents. How attentive he appeared to her, and how respectful he remained to his family, set the tone for how others would judge the strength of the new union. In some regions, playful rituals also marked the morning after. Friends or younger relatives might tease the couple, making jokes about their wedding night, or even demanding small gifts before letting them leave their chamber. These light-hearted games added humor and relieved some of the pressure of formality. Yet beneath the laughter lay a deeper meaning. The new couple was being tested not only on their ability to endure ritual, but also on their ability to accept teasing, to laugh together, and to bond as husband and wife in the face of social scrutiny. By the end of the morning, the couple had passed through another threshold. They were no longer simply the bride and groom of a single day's spectacle. They were now husband and wife in the eyes of the family and the community. The bride had shown her respect. The groom had shown his attentiveness, and together they had begun weaving themselves into the fabric of the household. The morning after customs may not have been as grand as the wedding procession, or as lavish as the banquet, but they were just as important. They transformed the couple from ceremonial figures into active members of family life. And in ancient China, where harmony, hierarchy, and filial duty formed the backbone of society, those first gestures over tea and bows carried weight far beyond the moment. They were the first steps into a lifetime of shared obligations, mutual respect, and hopefully, enduring partnership. While the wedding day itself was dominated by spectacle, and the morning after was focused on impressing the groom's household, ancient Chinese weddings didn't end there. One of the most important customs came shortly afterward: the formal visit to the bride's family. This wasn't just a casual trip home, it was a symbolic bridge between the two families, a reassurance to the bride's parents, and a way of showing that marriage, while a transfer of loyalty, didn't mean the severing of all ties. Traditionally, This return visit took place 3 days after the wedding, though the exact timing could vary depending on region and family custom. It was often referred to as the San Che Hui Men, meaning the third day return to the gate. The number 3 carried symbolic weight associated with harmony and balance, making it a fitting time for the bride's reappearance in her natal home. The bride didn't go alone. Her husband usually accompanied her, and in some cases attendants or members of the groom's family joined the procession. What made this visit stand out, however, was the careful balance it struck. The bride had left her family to begin a new life, but the visit reminded everyone that while she now belonged to her husband's household, her natal family was not erased from her life. It was a reminder of the enduring bond between parents and daughter. Even within the strict patriarchal structure of ancient China, the arrival at her family's home was an event in itself. The bride, now dressed more modestly than on her wedding day but still in elegant garments, entered the household she had known all her life. But this time, she was no longer a daughter living under her father's roof. She was a guest. The shift was subtle yet profound. Family members greeted her with joy, but the atmosphere was tinged with the awareness that she had changed status forever. The purpose of the visit was twofold. First, it reassured the bride's parents that she was being treated well by her husband and his family. The sight of her healthy, presentable, and seemingly happy was meant to calm their anxieties. Parents who had wept at her departure now found comfort in seeing her again so soon, looking secure in her new role. Second, it allowed the husband to formally show respect to his in-laws. His presence was proof that he valued their daughter and respected their contribution in raising her. Gifts played a key role in this visit. The couple often brought offerings from the groom's family to the bride's parents, items such as wine, cakes, or other foods. These gifts were tokens of gratitude, acknowledging the years of care and upbringing the bride's parents had provided. In return, the bride's family might present the couple with more gifts, sometimes household goods, sometimes symbolic items to bless the marriage. It was a reciprocal exchange reinforcing the bond between the two households. Meals during this visit carried their own symbolic meanings. A banquet might be held, smaller than the wedding feast but still abundant, celebrating the new union. Certain dishes were often served to symbolize good fortune, fertility, and prosperity. Eating together was more than hospitality. It was an affirmation of connection, a reminder that while the bride now lived elsewhere, the two families were linked by shared hopes for the future. For the bride, the visit was also a chance to show how much she had grown. Even in the short time since her departure, she was expected to demonstrate composure, modesty, and grace, signaling to her parents that she had stepped into her new role with dignity. Her behavior was watched closely, and her husband's attentiveness was equally scrutinized. If he treated her with visible respect and kindness, her parents felt reassured. If he appeared distant or dismissive, it could spark whispers of concern. This ritual visit also had a practical element. It allowed the bride to see her natal family one last time before her ties became less frequent. In many cases, after this formal return, her visits home would be rare and usually required permission. The first visit, then, carried a bittersweet quality. It was joyous reunion, but also a quiet acknowledgement that her life had truly changed. Parents might slip her advice, gentle reminders about patience, obedience, or managing her household wisely. These parting words echoed long after she returned to her new home. Regional variations gave this custom unique flavors. In some places, the return visit might happen, not after 3 days, but on the second day, or even after a full month. In wealthier families, the procession could be elaborate, with decorated carriages and attendants, while in rural communities it might be simpler, marked only by a modest meal. But the underlying meaning remained the same. It was about balance, reassurance, and respect. By the time the couple left the bride's family home, the ritual had accomplished its purpose. Two households had reaffirmed their bond. The bride's parents had seen with their own eyes that she was secure, and the young couple had taken another step in navigating the complex web of expectations that defined marriage in ancient China. The return visit wasn't as dramatic as the wedding procession, or as intimate as the mourning. After customs, but in its quiet way, it was deeply important. It provided closure for the bride's family, reassurance for the parents, and a symbolic bridge between the world she had left behind and the world she was now building with her husband. It was a ritual of connection, reminding everyone that marriage was not just the joining of two individuals, but the linking of two families, two lineages, and two sets of hopes for the future. When you picture a wedding today, one of the first images that probably comes to mind is the bride's dress. The gown has become the centerpiece of modern ceremonies, a symbol of beauty, purity, and sometimes extravagance. But in ancient China, wedding attire carried far more than aesthetic value. Every layer, every color, every embroidered detail was steeped in meaning, tied to centuries of cultural symbolism and cosmic belief. Wearing the right garments wasn't just about looking regal. It was about aligning the couple with heaven, earth, and the ancestors. For the bride, red was the dominant color. Red symbolized joy, prosperity, and fertility. It was considered the most auspicious shade in Chinese culture, believed to ward off evil spirits and attract blessings. The deep crimson of a wedding robe wasn't simply decorative. It was a declaration that the marriage would be full of life and fortune. From her robe to her veil, red wrapped the bride in protective power. The bridal veil itself was iconic, often a square of bright red silk. It covered the bride's face during the procession, and sometimes through parts of the ceremony. This wasn't to conceal her identity, but to shield her from bad luck and wandering spirits. In some traditions, the groom would only lift the veil after certain rituals were completed, making that simple act a symbolic unveiling of their new life together. The bride's robes were usually elaborately embroidered with patterns that carried their own symbolic weight. Dragons, phoenixes, lotuses, and peonies were common motifs. The dragon represented strength and male energy, while the phoenix embodied beauty, grace, and female virtue together. They symbolized harmony between husband and wife. Flowers like peonies spoke of wealth and honor, while lotuses hinted at purity and rebirth. To the modern eye, these patterns might seem like decoration, but to the families involved, they were blessings stitched into fabric. Headwear was equally significant. Brides sometimes wore elaborate crowns or headpieces, often adorned with dangling beads of jade or pearls that shimmered with movement. These were not only displays of wealth, but also charms against misfortune. Jade in particular was thought to embody purity and protection. The weight of these ornaments could be considerable, but enduring that burden was itself symbolic. It showed the bride's readiness to bear the responsibilities of her new role. The groom's attire was no less symbolic. While it might lack the brilliant red of the bride's robes, it often leaned toward darker, richer colors like black or blue, symbolizing stability and authority. Dragons were common motifs for the groom as well, emphasizing strength and power. His hat, usually tall and formal, set him apart from ordinary men, marking the significance of the day. Like the bride, the groom was dressed not only as himself, but as a representative of his family, his ancestors, and the cosmic order. Accessories played an important role. Belts, shoes, sashes, and even hair ornaments carried meaning. The couple's shoes, for instance, were sometimes embroidered with images of mandarin ducks, which symbolized fidelity because these birds were believed to mate for life. Belts or sashes could carry talismans or charms to protect the marriage from harm. Every detail, down to the stitching, carried intent. Beyond individual meaning, the attire as a whole reflected Confucian ideals. Marriage wasn't viewed as a private affair. It was a social duty and a cosmic act. The couple's clothing was a visual representation of harmony between yin and yang, between heaven and earth. When the bride walked in her red robes and the groom stood in his formal garments, they weren't just two people entering marriage. They were embodying balance, order, and continuity of their families and community. The expense of such garments varied widely. Wealthy families could commission luxurious robes of silk, embroidered with gold thread, adorned with precious stones. Poorer families might settle for simpler versions, but even the humblest wedding attire carried red cloth and symbolic designs. To skip the symbolism would have been unthinkable, regardless of economic status. Families often saved for years to ensure their children's wedding attire reflected the proper respect for tradition. There was also an element of performance. Weddings in ancient China were not just private unions, but public events that displayed the family's status and virtue. The more resplendent the attire, the greater the impression made on guests and neighbors. It wasn't only about luck and symbolism. It was also about showing that the family respected tradition and had the resources to honor it properly. Even after the wedding, the garments carried meaning. In some traditions, the bride's robe was preserved, carefully stored, and sometimes worn again during major family ceremonies. It could become a treasured heirloom, passed down as a tangible link between generations. The symbolism stitched into its threads outlasted the day of the wedding itself, echoing through family rituals long afterward. In short, wedding attire in ancient China was never just clothing. It was a living text of symbols, colors, and designs, each chosen to align the couple with prosperity, harmony, and cosmic balance. To wear those robes was to step into a role far larger than oneself, to embody the hopes of two families, the ideals of society, and the blessings of heaven and earth. The garments were heavy, both in fabric and in meaning, but they made the couple more than individuals. They made them part of something eternal. After the formal rituals and the solemn symbolism of vows and attire, the wedding celebration in ancient China shifted into something more lively, more indulgent, and far more communal. This was the banquet, the great feast, where the union of two families was toasted, not in whispered prayers or careful bows, but in clinking cups of wine, steaming platters of food, and laughter that spilled out into the night. A wedding banquet wasn't just a meal. It was a spectacle. The number of dishes, their arrangement, even the order in which they were served, all carried symbolic meaning. To host a proper feast was to prove not only your joy, but also your respect for tradition and your ability to care for the guests. Skimping on the banquet would bring shame to both families. To overspend, however, was often a risk families willingly took, because a grand feast reflected honor, generosity, and prosperity. The centerpiece of the banquet was abundance. Guests expected to see the tables groaning under the weight of dishes, each one chosen not only for taste but for its symbolic blessing. Whole fish, for instance, was a must. Have fish, or yu in Chinese, sounded like the word for surplus. Serving it at a wedding was a way of saying, "May the couple always have more than enough." The fish was usually presented whole, with head and tail intact, symbolizing completeness in life and marriage. Roast pig was another staple, often displayed with great ceremony before being carved. The pig represented fertility, good fortune, and the continuation of family lines. Its presence was especially important in a society where marriage was expected to produce heirs. Serving such a dish was a loud, flavorful promise of descendants to come. Noodles were also a favorite, but not just any noodles, long, uncut ones. They symbolized long life and an unbroken future. Cutting them short was considered unlucky, so guests slurped them whole, laughing as they did, honoring the wish for the couple's enduring bond. Dumplings, too, were often present, their folded shapes resembling little ingots of silver or gold, carrying the blessing of wealth and prosperity. Sweet foods held a special place at the wedding table. Sticky rice cakes, honeyed fruits, and sesame pastries weren't only delicious. They symbolized sweetness in marriage and sticking together through life. The texture of sticky rice, for example, represented closeness and unity, an edible reminder that husband and wife should cling to each other no matter the challenges ahead. Wine flowed freely, especially rice wine, and drinking rituals were as important as the dishes themselves. The most significant of these was the Heejing ritual, where bride and groom would sip wine from the same cup, often joined by a red thread. This act symbolized their shared life and the blending of their destinies. Afterward, guests joined in with toasts, sometimes serious, sometimes playful, each one a verbal blessing wrapped in laughter. Banquets were noisy, jubilant affairs. Music played, drums, flutes, and sometimes stringed instruments like the guqin, setting the rhythm for celebration. Performers might entertain the guests with acrobatics, dances, or storytelling, depending on the wealth of the families. But even without entertainers, the banquet hall itself was a stage where guests joked, shared stories, and reveled in the joy of seeing two families joined. Seating arrangements were carefully observed. The most honored guests, often elders or community leaders, were given places of prominence near the head of the hall. Family members were interspersed with care, ensuring harmony and avoiding the appearance of favoring one side over the other. Even the act of where one sat was a delicate balance of respect, politics, and symbolism. For the families, hosting such a banquet was both a duty and a challenge. The costs could be staggering, particularly for poorer households, but the shame of a poorly stocked feast was worse. Families often saved for years to ensure the wedding table overflowed with plenty. The display wasn't just for the guests. It was a message to the community that the marriage was worthy of honor. The banquet could last for hours, sometimes spilling into the next day. Guests ate, drank, and toasted until the candles burned low and servants stumbled under trays of dishes. By the end, laughter filled the air, and the bride and groom were showered with not only blessings, but also the practical generosity of gifts, often money in red envelopes, to help them start their new life. In the end, the banquet was more than food. It was the physical embodiment of what marriage represented in ancient China: harmony, abundance, and shared joy. Every dish on the table was a prayer, every toast a promise, every laugh a reminder that marriage was not only about two individuals, but about families, communities, and generations. The feast ensured that the union was celebrated not in private but in the collective memory of everyone present, woven into the songs, tastes, and stories of the night. Once the rituals were complete and the banquet tables overflowed, the wedding in ancient China blossomed into another vital layer of celebration: the music, the performances, the entertainment that turned the solemnity of marriage into a festival of joy. To modern eyes, these moments might look like lively diversions, but in the minds of the people who lived them, they were more than just fun. They were acts of harmony, blessings set to rhythm, laughter, and song. Music was at the heart of it all. In Confucian thought, music wasn't only entertainment. It was a reflection of cosmic balance. The right notes could soothe emotions, bring order to chaos, and align human life with the greater harmony of heaven and earth. That's why at a wedding, music wasn't simply background noise. It was essential. Drums rolled to set the pace. Flutes carried melodies that floated above the chatter, and string instruments like the guqin or pipa added depth, weaving delicate notes into the air like threads of silk. Each instrument played its role in shaping the atmosphere. The drum, steady and commanding, symbolized authority and grounded the gathering. The flute, light and clear, embodied joy and celebration. Together, they balanced yin and yang. The heavy and the light, the masculine and the feminine, mirroring the balance the couple was expected to embody in marriage. Performances often accompanied the music. Acrobats might tumble through the hall, contorting their bodies into impossible poses that left guests gasping and laughing. Jugglers tossed objects in dazzling patterns, balancing bowls, plates, or even knives, showcasing human skill as a spectacle of abundance and control. Dancers spun in flowing silks, their movements graceful and precise, often telling symbolic stories through gesture. A performance wasn't simply to entertain, it carried meaning, reminding the audience of themes like harmony, prosperity, and longevities. Storytelling, too, played an important role. Professional storytellers, or even local elders, would recount tales of legendary marriages, heroic lovers, or mythological unions blessed by the gods. These stories weren't random entertainment. They framed the couple's marriage as part of a long lineage of love and duty, connecting their personal story to the timeless narratives of Chinese culture. Guests, full of food and wine, would listen, laugh, and sometimes reflect, their minds weaving the bride and groom into the mythic fabric of their heritage. For the wealthy, weddings could include elaborate operatic performances. Early forms of Chinese opera blended song, dance, and costume into one. Performers in brightly colored robes and painted faces might enact famous tales, while the guests feasted and toasted. The combination of music and theater turned the wedding into a true spectacle, something that could be remembered for generations. But entertainment wasn't only about professional performers. Guests themselves became part of the show. Drinking games were common, where riddles had to be solved before taking a sip, or cups were passed around in playful challenges. Poetry contests might spring up among the literate guests, with verses composed on the spot to praise the couple or make the crowd laugh. Even small children played their part, sometimes performing little dances or reciting lines they had memorized, delighting the audience with their innocence. All of this created an atmosphere where joy was shared and unity was celebrated not just through ritual, but through laughter and delight. The bride and groom, sitting in their formal attire, became the centerpiece of the entertainment as well. Guests would direct songs, jokes, and playful teasing at them, urging them to smile, drink, or blush, reinforcing the idea that marriage was not simply serious duty but also joy and companionship. To make music was to declare harmony. To perform dances was to embody grace. To tell stories was to pass wisdom. Even the most frivolous, seeming games carried an undercurrent of blessing. They reminded the couple and the community alike that while marriage demanded responsibility, it was also meant to bring happiness. For poorer families who could not afford professional entertainers, the community itself provided the music and joy. A neighbor with a flute, relatives who could sing folk songs, or friends willing to perform small plays ensured that no wedding was without laughter, and music. Wealth determined scale, but not spirit. In every setting, from humble village to grand hall, the essence of music and entertainment was the same: to turn the wedding into a memory steeped in joy. By the end of the night, as torches burned low and voices grew hoarse from singing, the air would still be vibrating with notes of drums and laughter. Guests might stumble home with full bellies and buzzing minds, carrying with them not just the taste of food or the images of fine robes, but the echo of music that had blessed the union. The marriage wasn't only bound by ritual or witnessed by ancestors. It had been sealed in sound, in rhythm, in the shared joy of voices raised together. Marriage in ancient China was never just about two people. It was never simply the bride and groom who mattered. Instead, the wedding was a deeply communal event, a moment when the ties between families, neighbors, and villages were put on display and strengthened. To modern eyes, this might seem overwhelming. So many people involved in what we now call a private affair. But in the Chinese worldview of the time, marriage was a social contract as much as a personal one, and the role of community was essential to its success. From the moment the wedding was announced, the community stirred with involvement. Neighbors lent their hands in preparation, helping to set up spaces, cook food, or decorate the household. This wasn't simply out of kindness. It was a way of affirming that they, too, were stakeholders in the bond being created. Marriage represented stability, continuation of family lines, and harmony within the larger social order. A strong marriage was good, not just for the families involved but for the whole community. Guests filled the wedding from every angle. Relatives came from afar, bringing gifts and well wishes. Villagers and townsfolk, even those not directly tied to the family, attended to take part in the shared joy. It was common for people to see their attendance not merely as an obligation, but as a duty to society itself. By being there, they bore witness, legitimized the union, and in turn, reinforced the bonds that held the community together. A heart of this communal involvement was reciprocity. Those who celebrated one wedding could expect their own to be celebrated in return. A family who gave generously in gifts or effort now could rely on the community's support when it was their turn. In this way, weddings acted like a social glue, weaving obligations and loyalties into a tight web. No one stood alone. Everyone's fortunes were tied to one another's. The community also carried symbolic weight during the rituals. When guests laughed during the entertainment, cheered during the feast, or participated in toasts, they weren't only enjoying themselves. They were actively blessing the couple. Joyful noise was thought to drive away misfortune. Laughter kept away spirits of ill luck. The community's presence was, in itself, a kind of protection spell cast over the bride and groom, ensuring their marriage started on a path of fortune. But it wasn't just about celebration. It was also about accountability. In ancient China, a marriage wasn't sealed only between two families. It was bound under the eyes of the community. Should difficulties arise later, disputes, separation, dishonor, it was not seen as merely private business. The community could step in, intervene, or pass judgment. By witnessing the vows and rituals, the guests acted as guardians of the marriage, silently pledging to uphold the union by their recognition of it. This communal responsibility also extended to the younger generation. Weddings were teaching moments for children and young adults. They watched the rituals, the banquets, the honoring of ancestors, and they absorbed the lessons of duty and family. The laughter and joy told them marriage was desirable. The solemn rituals told them it was sacred. The entire spectacle was as much about transmitting values forward as it was about celebrating in the present. For poorer households, the community role was even more vital. They might not have had the resources to host an elaborate feast or hire entertainers, but the community often filled in the gaps. Neighbors could lend food, utensils, or manpower. A wedding, even when modest, became grand through the collective effort of many hands. This sense of shared responsibility allowed the joy of marriage to extend across all levels of society, preventing it from being the privilege of only the wealthy. At the same time, the community's role could bring pressure. A failed marriage or scandal between husband and wife reflected poorly, not just on the families, but on the larger network of kin and neighbors. The involvement of the community meant that reputation was at stake. Harmony had to be maintained, for discord was not simply personal. It threatened the fabric of the whole. This gave marriages an added layer of weight, reminding the couple that they were never acting in isolation, but always as part of something larger. In the end, the role of community in ancient Chinese weddings revealed a worldview deeply different from the individualism of today. Marriage was not a private escape or a purely romantic act. It was a knot tied in the presence of many. A binding that tied two people, not only to each other but to every face gathered around them. The laughter, the toasts, the gifts, and the songs were all threads woven into the fabric of the union, making it strong, enduring, and unshakable. As the feast ended and the guests returned home, they carried with them the glow of the event. The marriage wasn't only a memory for the couple, it belonged to everyone who had been there. It was a shared joy, a shared duty, and a shared promise that the future would be faced together. Clothing in an ancient Chinese wedding was never chosen at random. Every layer, every stitch, every hue carried meaning. To us today, it might look like vibrant fashion or elaborate tradition. But to those who lived within the culture, clothing was language. It spoke of prosperity, purity, authority, and harmony with the cosmos. To truly understand what weddings were like in ancient China, one must pause and examine the colors and garments that surrounded the ceremony. The most striking feature of a bride's attire was the dominance of red. Unlike the white gowns we see in many Western weddings today, red was the ultimate wedding color in ancient China. It symbolized joy, life, and fertility. Red was believed to banish evil spirits and misfortune, while simultaneously drawing in happiness and luck. A bride dressed in red was not just beautiful, she was armored in a protective aura, cloaked in a hue that ensured her path forward would be blessed. The groom, too, often wore red, though sometimes with touches of black to emphasize authority and stability. It represented solemnity and strength, qualities desirable in the man who was expected to lead and protect his household together. The balance of red and black hinted at the harmony between joy and responsibility, between passion and duty, that a marriage was meant to embody. Gold and yellow were also present, though less common, as they were historically reserved for emperors and high nobility. Yellow, especially the deep golden shade known as huang, symbolized the center of the universe and imperial authority. If a family of noble rank allowed their bride or groom to don yellow accents, it was not merely decorative, it was a declaration of status and cosmic alignment. To wear gold threads and embroidery was to drape oneself in the favor of heaven. The garments themselves were layered and complex. The bride often wore a honggua or red robe, richly embroidered with auspicious symbols. Dragons and phoenixes were among the most common designs. The dragon represented male power, vigor, and the groom himself. The phoenix symbolized grace, virtue, and the bride. Together, the two creatures in swirling embroidery represented the harmony of yin and yang, the balance of masculine and feminine forces. Their union on the fabric mirrored the union taking place in the ceremony. Other motifs stitched into the clothing carried hidden blessings. Peonies, symbols of wealth and honor, were frequent. Lotus flowers suggested purity and harmony. Even bats, which might seem odd to us today, appeared often in embroidery, because the word for bat, fu, was a homophone for the word good fortune. Every image was intentional, a visual prayer sewn into the very fabric that touched the couple's skin. The headpieces worn by brides deserve special mention. Depending on status, A bride might wear a crown, like headdress known as a fengguan, adorned with dangling pearls, gold ornaments, and sometimes kingfisher feathers, whose brilliant blue shimmer was prized. The headdress wasn't only a display of wealth, it symbolized transformation. By wearing it, the bride shifted from the daughter of one household to the matron of another. The heavy elaborate crown weighed physically on her head, reminding her of the seriousness of her new role. Veils, too, played an important role. Brides often wore a red veil that covered their face, only lifted by the groom during the ceremony. This act symbolized not only the revelation of her beauty, but also the groom's acceptance of responsibility to protect and cherish her. The removal of the veil was a turning point, marking the moment when the two lives truly became one. Even the shoes were steeped in symbolism. A bride might wear red silk shoes embroidered with auspicious motifs, while the groom's footwear was sturdy and formal, marking his role as the household's foundation. Stepping into marriage was a literal and symbolic act, and the shoes guided them onto the shared path with every careful stride. Beyond the bride and groom, the guests also participated in this language of clothing. Relatives dressed in festive garments, often choosing colors like bright reds, greens, and blues, each carrying its own auspicious associations. What they wore was a reflection of respect to the couple and an offering of harmony to the gathering. When the ceremony unfolded, the sea of red and gold, accented with embroidered symbols, transformed the space into a living tapestry. The clothing wasn't separate from the ritual. It was part of it, binding together the values of joy, fertility, prosperity, and cosmic harmony. What may seem, at a glance, like dazzling fashion was in truth a coded system of blessings, a dialogue between heaven and earth, written in silk and thread. Every color and pattern said something about the family's hopes, about the balance of roles, about the sacredness of the union. In ancient China, to wear a wedding garment was to step into an inheritance of meaning larger than oneself. It was to wrap one's body not only in fabric but in centuries of tradition and the blessings of countless ancestors. When the newlyweds looked at each other in their resplendent attire, they weren't simply seeing clothing, they were seeing the weight of heritage, the promise of fortune, and the vibrant colors of a shared destiny. And as they bowed to the ancestors and to each other, the very garments they wore seemed to echo back the vows they could not speak aloud: loyalty, harmony, and a future blessed with joy. When we look back at the elaborate customs, the colors, the rituals, and the symbolism of ancient Chinese weddings, it's tempting to see them as relics, traditions fossilized in time. But the truth is, their legacy didn't vanish with the dynasties. It lingered, adapted, and still pulses quietly beneath the surface of many modern ceremonies today. Weddings, after all, are not just about two people. They are about continuity, about weaving the past into the future. And in China, perhaps more than anywhere else, that thread of continuity runs deep. Consider the red color, the dominant hue of ancient wedding attire. Even now, red envelopes, red dresses, red lanterns, and red decorations remain standard in Chinese weddings. The belief in red as a force that drives away misfortune and ushers in happiness has never faded. Brides today may wear a white Western-style gown during part of the ceremony, but at some point, many still don the traditional chipao or kua, usually embroidered in brilliant red with golden phoenixes and dragons. It is a direct link to the same beliefs their ancestors held 1,000 years ago. The dragon and phoenix pairing, too, has survived the centuries. Once stitched into robes and headpieces, the motif now appears on jewelry, invitations, and even the design of the banquet hall. The symbolism is unchanged: the dragon for the groom, the phoenix for the bride, yin and yang in perfect harmony. Modern couples, knowingly or not, still echo the cosmic balance invoked by those ancient embroidered patterns. Even some of the old rituals live on, though often in abbreviated or adapted forms. The bowing ceremony, where bride and groom knelt to heaven, earth, and ancestors, still appears in traditional-style weddings, especially in rural areas or families that cling tightly to custom. It is not always performed with the same solemnity as in the past, but the essence remains. In a world where technology dominates, bowing to unseen ancestors is a powerful reminder of where one comes from. The emphasis on family honor, too, persists. Ancient Chinese weddings were about forging alliances between clans as much as they were about romance. While today's marriages may lean more heavily on personal choice, the idea that a wedding unites families, not just individuals, has not disappeared. Parents and elders still play an influential role in the process, guiding, blessing, and sometimes even negotiating aspects of the ceremony. Food traditions also show the endurance of ancient customs. Banquets brimming with symbolic dishes, fish for abundance, dumplings for wealth, lotus seeds for fertility, still form the centerpiece of modern receptions. Guests may not consciously think of them as superstitious symbols, but the associations are so deeply ingrained in cultural memory that to leave them out would feel incomplete. The ritual of the bridal veil, once a heavy red cloth lowered over the bride's face, has also found echoes in modern practice. Today, many brides wear a delicate Western-style veil, but the act of unveiling, once a sacred moment where the groom revealed his bride, still resonates with its ancient meaning. It remains the symbolic unveiling of a new chapter of life. Even the elaborate headpieces of old, with their dangling pearls and kingfisher feathers, live on in spirit. Modern brides may wear crowns, tiaras, or ornate hairpins in gold or silver, often designed in phoenix shapes. The weight may be lighter, the style sleeker, but the symbolism of transformation and dignity is preserved. What has changed most, perhaps, is the balance between tradition and personal freedom. Ancient Chinese weddings were tightly bound to ritual, with little room for deviation. Today, couples blend elements freely, borrowing from Western customs or tailoring old rituals to fit their own values. Yet even in this blending, the bones of the old ways are visible. The symbolism of red, the honoring of ancestors, the belief in auspicious timing, these are not abandoned but adapted, like rivers that shift course while still flowing to the sea. This adaptability may be the true legacy of ancient Chinese weddings. They were never frozen in time but alive, breathing with each new generation. Every dynasty added its own flavor, every region its own customs, yet the underlying themes of harmony, prosperity, and respect endured. That endurance speaks to the power of ritual, not just to reflect culture, but to shape it. When a modern bride stands in a red silk dress, when a family gathers at a banquet table heavy with symbolic dishes, when incense curls toward the sky to honor ancestors, they are not simply participating in quaint traditions. They are stepping into a continuum that stretches back thousands of years. They are touching hands with the past, ensuring it still walks alongside them into the future. So what is the lasting legacy of ancient Chinese weddings? It is this, that through all the upheavals of history, through dynastic rise and fall, through revolutions and modernizations, the rituals of marriage have remained one of the most enduring mirrors of Chinese culture. They show how people understood the universe, how they valued family, and how they sought to weave harmony into the fabric of daily life. A wedding is never just about two people. In ancient China, it was about ancestors, families, communities, and the cosmos itself. And even now, when couples speak their vows beneath red silk and golden embroidery, the legacy of that worldview shines through. The ceremony becomes not only a beginning for the bride and groom, but a continuation of something far older, something that binds heaven, earth, and humanity in a single, unbroken thread.